Okay, welcome everybody to this Kingston University Writing Cultures seminar. Very pleased today to have a presentation by Julien Clin. Before starting his PhD, Julien worked as a freelance broadcast journalist for years. He was a foreign correspondent in Berlin, a reporter in London, a documentary maker in Paris. He has experience in front of the camera, but is most interested in voice and words. Julien holds a master's degree in modern language from the University of Tübingen and in creative writing from the University of Oxford. Alongside his PhD, Julien works with Arup's Foresight team, where his focus lies on future cities and the social value of place. In this seminar, Julien will present some work in progress, and the title for this session is Walking with Martin, Thinking with Heidegger. So I shall pass it over to Julien.
Thanks, Kate. I'll just upload my slides quickly. Welcome everyone from various parts of the world. Can you see that?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so yes, Walking with Martin, Thinking with Heidegger. I'm just gonna jump straight into it, and for the visual people among you, there's hardly anything in terms of visuals, so feel free to just close your eyes and listen if that's what you'd like to do. So in the village where my mum lives in Germany, where I spent much of my youth, there's a path called the Sebastian Blau Trail. That's the only visual of the talk, by the way. Sebastian Blau was a vernacular poet. He wrote in the local Swabian dialect, and at one of my favorite spots that overlooks the river and the valley, there's one of his poems on a plaque. It begins, hop gardens, the forest, fields, a quarry, vineyards and meadows, and in between, the Neckar, all beautifully arranged. And Blau's affinity for the place becomes palpable, even though his tone is quite matter-of-fact. He doesn't embellish, nor does he feel the need to, because his language reflects the local culture. Swabians are known as people of few words. I've had worse is a rare compliment around here. Swabians are thrifty, hard workers, their feet firmly on the ground. And for Blau, the people are just like, continue the poem, that little town that lies in the valley, urban on the outside, but pastoral within. And in the poem, the time passes by, the seasons change. Sunshine follows snowfall, yet the simple tone belies a melancholy. It harks back to a time that Sebastian Blau, and Sebastian Blau is the pseudonym of Joseph Eberle, a journalist and broadcaster who was banned by the Nazis and had to go into hiding because, simply, he had married a Jewish woman. So this poem also harks back to a time that Blau understands is no longer. He continues, boys become fathers, children, people. The age of innocence comes to an end. Blau knows that to the objective observer, to you and me, this place is nothing special. And he anticipates our reaction and he writes, well, you'll say, what's he on about? As though that were worth writing about. And it's perhaps your reaction too right now as I'm telling you this. So why am I telling you this? And Blau concludes, it's but a small word, and yet, you see, that's the crux of it, that I can call this place my Heimat. Heimat, home. That's why I'm telling you this, because I've become fascinated with this little word and with the depths and the riches of its associations, with the existential importance that it has for any of us. It's a basic human need, but as I've come to understand, it is also a fundamental part of our identity. And before I get to the meat of this paper, which is about a creative writing approach to this topic, I need to give you some context. That'll take about 5 minutes, and then I'll do 2 readings for about 15 minutes or so. And then if I've not bored you or confused you into a paralysis, then we'll have time for discussion. So the concept. Heimat is a German concept. Well, I wouldn't say it really is a German concept, but as for so many things, the Germans have a word for it. And what's important to understand is that it's much more than the English home, which tends to be more individual, more strongly connected to a specific abode. Heimat, if we put it simply, and that's very simply, is a geographically anchored notion of belonging that bestows identity through a common place and a shared imaginary. So to share a Heimat is to share a communal identity that is bigger than the personal one. And to be clear, that doesn't erase the individual, but it gives the individual something that is shared. So Blau can call that little town of his Heimat because he recognizes himself in the people, because he too thinks of himself as pastoral on the inside, because he was once one of those boys that became fathers. And so as I began to explore this notion of home, I inevitably encountered Martin Heidegger. His existential concept of Dasein, or being in the world, explains the importance of place. He says, again very briefly, that authentic experience can only happen within a specific context and in relation to others. The world precedes the self, or rather the self cannot be thought of separately from the world that it is in. So it's the precise opposite of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Edward Casey, one of the commentators on Heidegger, sums it up like this. To live is to live locally, and to know is first of all to know the place one is in. So place here is something specific and bounded. It becomes the foundation of experience. And so taking this further, if Heimat is to be the place of belonging, then to ever fully be oneself, one must begin with the process of learning one's place. Home begins outside the self. The identity is bestowed from the outside. Now, I find it quite difficult to argue against this understanding of phenomenology and the limitations that place imposes on us. And it's not a surprise, really, that Heidegger and his idea around that have become some of the most influential of the 20th century. And I think, ultimately, that there's a lot of good that can be drawn from this conclusion. But the problems are that, first, Heidegger is a very unsavory character, and two, that the notion of Heimat was appropriated by fascists, racists, nativists, xenophobes, you name it. But it's much too important, I think, to leave it to them because it is so fundamental. Now, so how do we reconcile this? And that's what I'm trying to do in this chapter that I call Walking with Martin, Thinking with Heidegger. Now, I should say at this point that my PhD is a piece of creative nonfiction, and I chose this format after having started in pure English lit, specifically to be able to explore this technique. Heidegger wrote extensively on this notion of being, and in his later stage, he also wrote a lot about home, about Heimat, about homecoming and homelessness. Now, if you've ever tried to read him, and I know some people in the room have, then you'll know that he delights in being obtuse. He's far too fond of etymology, and he creates new meanings for words that no one really knows. So it can all be quite cryptic. There's a commentator on him called Robert Mugerauer, who has a very interesting and enlightening take on Heidegger's style. And he says that Heidegger ultimately or essentially uses 6 different voices. That he moves from the straightforward representational language, which is quite easy to understand, even though the ideas might be complex, towards ever more poetically informed language, and then finally to a sort of originary poetic musing and obscure dialectical sayings. And Mugerauer puts it thus, that it correlates more closely with the language of the place, that springs from the simplicity of the ordinary, but remains crucially far removed from the trivializing average everyday. And that, far removed from the trivializing average everyday, is what I call cryptic and what I call sort of like not really understandable. And yet within there are ideas that I think are really valuable. So there are texts, for example, like The Pathway or Der Feldweg, which, as I see it on that spectrum, are quite far on the end of poetic musings and dialectical sayings. And it's a text that's only about 5 pages long, but it gripped me a lot more than I expected it would. And what I find fascinating in it is that Heidegger is poeticizing his local experience in an attempt to arrive at something abstract, at a universal idea. So there, the parochial becomes a conduit to the universal, as the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh puts it. And so I thought, in trying to understand what he's saying, it would be best to just try and go on that walk with him. So this is where I begin my first reading. As the crow flies, Meeskirch is only about 30 miles south of Remingsheim, which is my mum's village. The Black Forest and the foothills of the Swabian Alps, where my mother lives, are within the same historical landscape shaped by centuries of Alemannic influence. Landscape, or Landschaft in German, is another indication of the link that German culture sees between people and place. Unlike the English word, Landschaft means both the geography and the community of a place, or more accurately, the land as it is shaped by the people. Now, this is particularly true in southern German dialects like Swabian. And this is a cultural knowledge that I share with Heidegger, and it's relevant and helpful. My understanding of Swabian, which my grandparents and my uncles spoke, allows me perhaps to understand Heidegger more immediately, more empathetically than some other readers of his. As we walk, I imagine that he speaks Swabian, the dialect he spoke when he was at home, when he felt most at ease. Grüß Gott, Martin says as I meet him in the palace gardens. It is the standard greeting around here, considered much friendlier and more welcoming than Guten Tag. God greet you is meant to suggest blessings, a wish of good things happening to the interlocutor. And it's the first time I actively think about the expression, and the first indicator as well of religion as also, or perhaps even more so, a cultural rather than a spiritual aspect of life. While some atheists and people of other confessions refuse to use this greeting, many, including myself, don't think twice about it. And that God appears in it explicitly reveals to me that he, or she, they, it, is also present in French and Spanish farewells. Adieu to God, adios, respectively. And even in the English goodbye, which is a contraction of God be with you. Now compare that to another common greeting around here, servus. Like its Italian equivalent ciao from schiavo, this comes from the Latin for slave. The suggestion is that I am at your service, and yet, upon reflection, there is an implied power dynamic at play rather than the equalizing entreatment to a third otherworldly party. So it's a mark of kindness and goodwill to commend you to God. God here is spelled with a lowercase g, a signal that you and I are part of the same community. Grüß Gott, I reply habitually. And then we begin the walk, and what you can't see here as I'm reading is that I'm using Martin's own words from the pathway, from that text. And we walk, and along the edge, the path greets a tall oak tree beneath which stands a roughly hewn bench. There, he tells me, the young Martin used to sit with great thinkers' writings which youthful clumsiness was trying to decipher. Well, much like I'm trying to decipher you, Martin, I think. Walking on this path, he says, helped me with the puzzles when the puzzles crowded into each other. The path remains just as ready for the thinker's steps as for those of the farmer who goes out to mow in the early morning. Well, decipher is the right word. I feel a bit lost. What do you mean, Martin? I ask. I sense a shift in his voice. He begins to speak with the mild euphoria of happy memories, like an excited child whose sentences flow into one another, like a child whose imagination fills gaps left blank in what he says. It's as if this oak tree were a gateway into a world, or rather, that it gathers elements to form this world. From its bark, Martin tells me, he and his friends used to carve little boats that they would flow in the nearby brook. The oak tree provided a springboard for dreamlike voyages, whose safety was guaranteed because on these journeys, you could easily get to your destination and return home again. Literally home, to mother's unspoken care. For a moment, Martin's story reminds me of my own. It's a memory that is tied to a beech tree that no longer exists, felled as it was to make way for housing, but whose stump remains to call back the tale. I was about 8 or 9 years old. My brothers and I were playing with our neighbours in the treehouse we had built. It was nothing fancy, just a couple of boards nailed into that beech tree. And beech trees are the best for climbing, where we could hide and imagine new worlds. We were being unduly loud, as boys will be, and from across the meadow there came the shouts of a woman ordering us with her Swabian charm to be quiet or else. We were 5 boys, we were up to any challenge, and we always opted for or else. The woman came our way with a besom. Was this a cliché children's book? And threatened to pull our ears long if she called us. We climbed down from the treehouse and hid in the maize field behind it, but she did not relent. The women, like the men in the village, had an admirable patience when it came to enforcing rules. We had met our match. We held a council and decided to sacrifice one of us for the team. The hammer fell on Marco, the older of the neighbor's boys. Sheepishly, he crawled out of the maze and, true to her promise, Swabians, more often than not, are quite literal in everything they say, Heidegger being a notable exception here. The woman pulled Marco to his house by his ears. We had played, Marco had lost. Yet that void still ended in the comfort and care of his mother, who could only laugh at the situation. Pay attention, will you? Martin calls me back to Enried. Listen. Listen to the oak tree. Do you hear it? It speaks of a slowness and consistency. That is how it grows, and only such growth can build what lasts and bears fruit. The look on my face tells him that he's on the verge of losing me, and so he rephrases himself. Inwardly, I imagine he's rolling his eyes at me. When you look at this oak tree, how old it is, what it has witnessed, all the nutrients it has drawn from the soil, those it has given back, the food it has provided to squirrels and jays and others, the shade it has given to generations of farmers on a hot summer's day, and to me as I read. What it tells me is that to grow means to open oneself up to the expanse of the sky, and at the same time to sink roots into the darkness of earth. The sky is the appeal of the new, like the boys and their boats. The earth anchors and protects. There is a silence as I repeat his words to myself and try to decipher them. You're talking about being in the world, aren't you? I say tentatively. Yes, Martin's excitement grows still more. He even smiles a little now. The path gathers in what has its being around it. The wide expanse of everything that grows and abides along the pathway is what bestows world. So that's the end of the first reading. And through this walk, something transpires. Instead of getting at abstract ideas from the specific, which is what he claims to do, what Martin's actually doing is to actualize his abstract ideas. It's a kind of reverse engineering. And it's important to see that reverse direction because in this way, I've come to realize, we only really hear Martin, the person, and his take on Heidegger, the thinker. So I'll say this again. Martin, the person, Heidegger, the thinker. The specific actualized in a particular context is automatically politicized through his opinions, whereas the universal, not yet tangible, is not yet political. And if we take the two to be the same, then we also pollute the abstract ideas. That's when we throw out the baby with the bathwater. Now, I can't claim to be the originator of this idea. Many philosophers and others have thought to retrieve Heidegger's ideas from Martin's actions and opinions, and others have pointed out the inherent contradictions within his work. Habermas, for example, says, with Heidegger, against Heidegger. But by framing it as Martin versus Heidegger, I hope to clarify this distinction of a pre-political idea and its politicizing actualization. And the place where I've come to point this out is in Martin's hut. And now I come to the second reading. So this is a hut that Heidegger had built for himself. The hut near Totnauberg is where Martin likes to retreat away from Freiburg, where he teaches. It's on a steep slope in the higher part of the Black Forest, which is thus called because the Romans found it inaccessible due to its dense woods and many ravines. It was to them the Silva Nigra, dark because their culture didn't penetrate it. Nowadays, it looks like the name could also come from the many spruce and fir trees whose dark needles make it look night blue and whose density give it an eerie feel. Walking in these woods, it's easy to understand the mood of the Brother Grimm's fairy tales. And the metaphorical, more than the literal remoteness, I realize, strongly shape Martin's world. So much so that he calls this hut his work world, the place where his thinking crystallizes. Now, crystallization occurs when various elements organize into a structure, becoming clear and fixed. And it's an interesting choice of words. The solidity suggests a certain rigidity of thought, and more importantly, this process of moving from the gaseous molecular state into a crystal suggests that this is where Heidegger becomes Martin. The abstract and conceptual thought becomes Martin's interpretation of it. And his is a thinking which he says is intimately rooted in and related to the life of the peasants. Now, of course, this is the path that Martin describes earlier on our walk. Being in the world, it is context specific. Those who get that sense of Heimat get it from the path, he said. Yet, I couldn't help but think that in the same sentence, he contradicted not only Heidegger, but even himself. Somebody who does not already have it can never acquire it, he says. The path speaks only as long as there are people born in its atmosphere who can hear it. They are servants of their origin. Now I wonder why this necessity to be born in its atmosphere. If one gets the sense of Heimat from walking the path, as he says, then surely this sense can, even must, be acquired. And if it can be acquired, then why only by those who are born there? In the hut, the kettle begins to whistle and on the old kitchen stove. There is firewood in a wicker basket next to it. Martin gives me tea, which he pours into the cup through a sieve. It's a herbal tea, chamomile and peppermint and other flowers grown locally. What did you mean, I ask, by being a servant of your origin? My work, he answers after a pause for consideration, comes from centuries-long and irreplaceable rootedness in the Alemannian Swabian soil. It remains embedded in what happens in a region. In that, I stand in serfdom to the place. He explains that hearing the message of the path, to be at one with the place, and perhaps even ordering ourselves according to it, depends on our being able to become open to the origin by first recognizing that we do not produce it. I agree with him there. It is, after all, what Heidegger says. Only, as I read it, origin is not literal. Few things are in Heidegger, I remind Martin. The origin is the world as it is around us, and that changes because it has never been fixed. To think that the soil, even the metaphorical soil, has remained unchanged for centuries is an illusion. To know one's origin, I continue boldly to Martin, is to be attuned to the constantly changing world and to remain engaged with it. The path speaks to those who walk it. Where I was born has absolutely nothing at all to do with it. And by claiming that those who were not born in the path's atmosphere cannot ever acquire its wisdom, fundamentally is to misunderstand how Heidegger thinks. Place gathers in the fourfold of earth, sky, mortals, and gods. All of these elements change. Place gathers and regathers constantly. It is made and co-made by and with others over time. This is what Heidegger tells us. And in this, it changes us. So being a servant to one's origin, which is the place that shapes a person actively, not the one from which the person came, means to embrace change. And Martin, it seems to me, comes from a position of a disconnect. On the path, he kept harking back to his childhood memories, to the ways in which his father and other craftsmen used to work, to a past that is no longer there. On the path, he made such a fuss about birth, and here in this hut, he claims to be in tune with villagers and farmers. And yet, the hut is up a steep slope away from the village. When a snowstorm rages and the hut veils and covers everything, it is the perfect time for philosophy. He engages little with the villagers. When they meet, he admits, they hardly even speak. And then there is an 83-year-old woman who comes to check on him because she worries he's been stolen off unawares. Martin, it transpires, is completely disconnected from his world. He operates in an imagined version of it. It's a world he attempts to create, with a pseudo-archaic language that he seeks to bend to his own meaning, and then, as Martin rather than as Heidegger, seeks to impose on others. In this claim to a monopoly over authenticity, Martin forgets that the world takes precedence, and that as an individual, he has no power to shape it. I understood in the hut what nostalgia really meant. Nostalgia is a homelessness that festers from that disconnect from place, because one did not embrace the changing world. Suddenly lost in place, the nostalgic seeks to return home by moving backwards, to some dream of a fixed landscape. Yet, being in the world, Heimat, can only be found in presence, that is, in the present. Nostalgia calls us into servitude not of our origin, but of its machinations, of its myths. Standing in this remote hut, with tellingly small windows, I see better why Martin is attracted to the Nazi ideology of blood and soil, which should not have appealed to Heidegger, for it promises only artificial things. It is a cacophony of myths, a pretense of place, an imposition of an invented idea of Germanness, rather than a rootedness in the region. And this is why Celia Applegate reminds us that Heimat was pulled out of the rubble of the Nazi Reich as a victim, not a perpetrator, because the two are not compatible. Sorry, so engaging with the place makes things much clearer. Martin's claims don't really add up. He's disconnected from his world and he operates in his own imaginary. So that's what nostalgia is, the absence of home. And Martin's politicization, when we think about it, is that he wants to return home. His is a homecoming, and by necessity, that's backwards looking and thus impossible under the laws of atrophy. Time moves relentlessly forward. Do you hear that, Martin? Heidegger says being in time. Home, Heimat, is making and remaking. It requires an active engagement and an embrace of change. It's not about homecoming at all, but about homemaking. And reframing it in this way, Heidegger's ascription of an existential importance to place, of an identity-giving aspect to Heimat, that prevails. But what crumbles is the nativist, nostalgic understanding of it. Home doesn't need to be defended because it can't be fixed. We can't return home because home changes. So the only thing we can do is to commit to this common ground that we share, to give to it as much as we take, because that's what roots ultimately are. So Heimat is to make and co-make. And Heimat, as the exiled philosopher Ernst Bloch once said, becomes the principle of hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting, even for someone who has, like me, who has no background in this at all. Really fascinating. So we have some time for questions and discussion. And open the floor to anybody who'd like to comment. Tobias?
Hey, Julien, that was great. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. It was really great to hear your world and the worlds of Heidegger and everything colliding. I'm interested, is quite transactional, but also thinking about my own PhD, which is practice based, and having to think about the justification of bringing creative practice into research. How you sort of frame the methodology of bringing together these sort of personal literary reflections with the theory. Like, how have you sort of thought about how those contribute to knowledge, I guess?
I think one of the things, and that's in the full chapter, that's what I'm trying to do, is that, I mean, for a start, Heidegger talks a lot about the poetic experience. And so by engaging with it myself, I'm engaging in that poetic experience. So the own practice of writing and of that way engaging with place helps me frame the idea of homemaking when it comes to myself. And then that contrasts it with others. So I also use other poets, other writers, and ultimately I moved this all to London. So the four main chapters of the PhD will be that fourfold: earth, sky, mortals, and gods, as they are experienced in London by myself and by others. And so by contrasting my own practice with the one of others, I can sort of highlight the differences. And that's what I'm trying to do in this as well, where I show that my engagement with this same place is completely different. If that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I'm then thinking, like, and this is like super transactional. Like, then how do you frame that insight? Because this is what I'm going through. Like, I'm making stuff at the same time as thinking about how other people make stuff. As you're writing at the same time as you think about how other people write stuff. And it's taken ages to think about how you frame that serendipitous learning as useful knowledge for others. And I guess that's what I was sort of trying to get at, how you're thinking about how other people are coming to your reflections on these experiences.
I'll have to give that one more thought, Tobias. Maybe we could talk about it, come up with a shared answer. Because yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you anyway. It was really beautiful. It was really
my supervisor's not here to hear me not having a clue.
Okay, it's all being recorded.
That's good.
Can I ask something even more transactional, which really comes from I'm a linguist, so all the kind of language aspects of it. So you're writing in English now, presumably, but I'm assuming the originals are in German. Yeah. Are you translating them yourself? Are you using a standard translation? I was just particularly interested because you said about the kind of insight that you have as someone who shares the common dialect, and whether that gives you maybe a different perspective on how his words might be translated.
Yes, I am actually engaging with that. There's a moment in the full chapter where I mentioned that. So I use mostly the published translation, but then I also highlight how I think of things differently, and because every translation is also an interpretation, and so where it becomes relevant, I pointed out. And there's one moment especially where even just the title of that piece, which is Der Feldweg, which can be the path or the pathway and all of that. So there I use it as actually a positive, because I translate it as a path from the start, and then the published translation says the pathway. And so that's where I turn it into actually a sort of method. So not the physical path that we're walking on, but actually the sort of like conceptual path to Heimat. So yeah, that's one of the things I'm trying to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and just those subtleties of difference of what's implied by path versus pathway, and that you as a writer would have insight into. Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you. And other questions? Sorry, go.
Sorry, yeah, and I mean the thing, and that's why Heidegger is so difficult and complicated, but also I find so interesting, is that like he almost arrives at a point where language itself becomes his Heimat, and so he cares a lot about language and makes a lot of fuss about it, but then also like uses this archaic language that no one really knows, creates these new meanings from some obscure etymology of things. And so you're like, okay, so you're not creating anything shared, you're really just like isolating yourself more and more into this weird creation that you have. And that's what I'm trying to get at in The Hut, where he's got like his own vision of this world, but he's actually quite disconnected from the shared world.
You spoke about the 6 different voices. Is that something that he was conscious of? Was he doing that deliberately, or was that something that's kind of identified
I
after the fact?
don't think, I think that's identified by Mugawa. I mean, that's why I read about it, and I don't think it's something that Heidegger actively said, but he does say about, you know, poetically man dwells, and he uses poetry a lot in his own philosophy, and then gradually moves more towards like writing his own weird poetic stuff. And then interestingly, in terms of the disconnect from the world, like one of his main inspirations is Hölderlin, who was based in Tübingen. So I, you know, throughout my time at university, I constantly was reminded of Hölderlin's presence, which also gives me that connection. But Hölderlin suffered from psychosis, some severe mental disorder, which meant that he spent most of his time in treatment and sort of isolated in this tower on the river. So it's an interesting thing that's what would be Heidegger's inspiration, because psychosis obviously is a disconnect from the world. So yeah,
really interesting. And of course, and sort of the translation of poetry, and the more poetic it gets, the kind of harder it is to capture in translation. Anyway, sorry. Anybody else would like to ask questions or comments, observations? You can pop it in the chat, you can unmic and speak, you can raise your hand. Edwin.
Hi, Julian. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I think the format really fits your purpose. Obviously, I've heard about it before, but see it in practice. I was just wondering if you had any trepidation about that approach, both in terms of wrangling with the problematic figure and also the unorthodox format of it. I mean, and kind of putting that out into the world, I suppose. Was there any trepidation? Was there like a mental barrier you had to get past, or did it just seem quite natural?
I'm going to say both. Constant trepidation, but Sarah has been really good at supporting me in that, and that really helps. So Sarah's my supervisor, for those who don't know. Yeah, it's a lot of like trial and error, I think. But it became quite natural because, I mean, as you know, I started in just like straightforward English lit and wrote much more academically about these ideas at first, and then it just became more suitable, more interesting to approach it in that way. And yeah, now as I'm doing it, I hope that even though I couldn't answer Tobias's question, that it actually does also like serve as an approach that creates meaning. But yeah, it's constantly worried about what it's going to be like. But that's partly the fun of it as well.
Yes, and this issue of nostalgia was really fascinating. Just thinking about it in my own work as well, in terms of the text I'm working on at the moment, they have this nostalgia for like it's environmental fiction, so they have this nostalgia for like a pre-climate change, pre-Anthropocene kind of bucolic paradise that probably never existed anyway. So I was really interested in what you had to say about like the idea of Heimat or home, or Heidegger's version of it being quite fixed, and the reality of home being more fluid. There was one quote you said that I even wanted to reference because it was quite relevant. So I'll have to talk to you afterwards about that. But something about nostalgia. But anyway, yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, nostalgia is a really interesting word. Like, I don't know how many people know here that it was first diagnosed in like 1680s by a Swiss physician, because he noticed that a lot of sort of Swiss people, especially soldiers who were sent to fight abroad and like, I don't know, papal protection or whatever, came back with quite a lot of like mental problems. So it's literally homesickness. So nostos is home in the sort of Greek sense of homecoming, and algia is pain. So it's this pain of not being at home. So I find that really interesting because it's not about time necessarily, but it's just this place around us sort of dismantling, and that can happen in the present. And I think we see that a lot because the people who tend to be the most nostalgic are the ones who've just not continued to embrace with that place. And yeah, so that's my take on nostalgia.
So there's some.
Thanks to- sorry.
Sorry, go.
I was just going to say thank you to Connor and Tobias for the words.
Yeah, and so there's some nice comments in the chat. So any other questions or comments? Okay, fantastic. So thank you all. Thank you, Julien, for your presentation and sharing your work with us. And thank you to those of you who have asked questions and put comments in the chat and just listened in enthusiastically. Thank you very much. I'm going to start the recording now. And